Hi, thanks for joining us for this web chat on Afghanistan here at Human Rights First. I'm Reagan Kuhn, and I'll be taking your questions. You can submit them on our Facebook page, through Twitter at Human Rights 1ST, or on the Ustream chat itself. I'm here with my colleagues, Daphne Evyatar and Gabor Rona, who just got back from a trip to Afghanistan. I'll let them introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their trip.
Hi, I'm Daphne, and this is Gabor.
Hi.
And we came back from Afghanistan about 2 weeks ago, and we were there for about 10 days looking at detention conditions, specifically looking at not specifically conditions so much as the due process given to detainees in U.S. custody in Afghanistan. So we're talking about more than 1,500 prisoners who are held by the United States at the Bagram Air Base, which is run by the U.S. in Afghanistan. That's about an hour and a half outside of Kabul. And the number of detainees held by the U.S. has jumped significantly. It's almost tripled in the last couple of years. So the main concern that we have now, although treatment conditions have improved, is whether they get a chance to defend themselves, whether the U.S. government is forced to make a case to explain why they're being held, and whether the detainees have an opportunity to say, wait, I don't know why I'm here, to defend themselves, to put on some sort of a defense to explain why, what happened. And basically what we found, I think, was pretty disappointing. I'll let Gabor explain a bit more. Also, Gabor was in Afghanistan earlier for Human Rights First and looked at some of these similar issues of due process for detainees. And I think we found some improvement, but still we feel like the detainees are not getting sort of the basic minimum due process that international standards would require.
And I think it's important, Daphne, to put some of this into historical context. Of course, the U.S. has been at war in Afghanistan for a long time now, and in the early days of the conflict, there was no due process at all for detainees. There were no procedures available whatsoever for detainees to claim their innocence, to challenge their detention. Slowly, and progress has been made, especially with the transition from the Bush to the Obama administration, and now the detainees get hearings. And a lot of what is contained in the rules for those hearings looks like real trials, looks like due process the way we would come to understand it. But what we found was that things that are happening actually on the ground in Bagram, in those proceedings, are not quite as rosy as they would appear if you were just looking at the procedures and rules on paper.
Yeah, that was actually very interesting to me because having spoken to the military, both of us had spoken to the military before we went, and we've met with people in Washington about these new rules, and we've read the rules on paper, and they do look significantly better than what the Bush administration had in place. And Gabor is right. Under the Bush administration, there were no hearings. To the extent that there were, they were secret, and the detainee was not allowed to attend them and didn't even know they existed. So there was no real defense presented. So it seemed on paper, and from our conversations with the military, that these were not only some improvement, but a significant improvement, and that now the detainee really gets to defend himself, and he gets a representative from the military to present his case. But what we found when we went there and we observed a day of hearings at the U.S. military base was that the representative, first of all, is not a lawyer and has no legal training. They have a 35 hours of training total on just what these hearings are about. And they don't really do very much. There was very little evidence that they investigate the case at all, that they didn't call a single witness on behalf of any of the detainees in the cases that we saw. They didn't present any evidence. They didn't demand that the military present any evidence to justify continuing to hold the detainee. And these were usually people who had already been in custody for at least several months. So that was really disappointing. I mean, I don't know about you. I think that for me that was one of the most disturbing things was what they called a personal representative wasn't really actually representing the interests of the detainee.
I think what was most striking is that we are accustomed to the idea that if somebody's being deprived of their liberty, then the authorities that are depriving them of their liberty have to present evidence to some kind of neutral fact finder that the person actually did what they're accused of doing. And what I think we found in these proceedings was a lack of appreciation of the distinction between allegations and evidence. Lots of allegations were made, but no evidence was actually presented. The detainee didn't have an opportunity to examine witnesses or examine documents or examine the reports of what was found on the premises that was incriminating. There was no lawyer representing the detainee. The personal representative, as you say, didn't really do much. And so the idea that these people who are detained by foreigners in their own land are having their day in court is really not quite true.
Right. And you were a criminal defense lawyer for a long time, so you know what a real criminal trial is supposed to look like. And I guess it was nothing like what we saw.
No, and that's not to say that in a war context, because this is war and these are not criminal charges, it's not to say that in a war context international law requires all of the protections that the U.S. Constitution would require in a criminal trial, but there are international legal standards that require that the grounds for detention be articulated in a law, and just as importantly, that the procedures be articulated in a law, and that those procedures meet minimum standards of due process. And I think we found that those minimum standards were not met here.
Right. And one thing, first I want to mention, because I didn't mention before, that Gabor is the International Legal Advisor for Human Rights First. So when it comes to international law, he knows what he's talking about. And he advises us on that. And in addition, I think the other thing that was really disturbing, in addition to the lack of representation and the lack of evidence, was the fact that whatever the bulk of the evidence that was presented in these cases apparently was all classified. It was secret, so we were not allowed to see it. The detainee was not allowed to see it. So we saw basically a series of cases where we would go in, we'd sit down, there was a board of military officers, and there was a military officer that would stand up and read the charges and say, this is, what we think you've done, and, you were seen planting IEDs, for example, without saying who saw the person planting IEDs. And then that was the extent of the evidence presented. And then after the detainee made his statement, which was usually along the lines of, I'm innocent, I don't know what you're talking about, I didn't plant IEDs, I don't like the Taliban, I have nothing to do with the Taliban, then they would close the hearing and say, okay, now we're going into classified session. The detainee would be removed from the room. All observers would be removed from the room.
Including us.
Including us, right. So we don't know what happened in there. But the detainee doesn't know what happened in there either. So basically these people are being held based on classified evidence. And interestingly, we have since asked for the outcomes of these hearings, and we've been told that that's not public information. So we can't even find out what was the result of any of the hearings that we observed.
Why don't we switch to a couple questions? That was a great introduction. Thank you, guys. We had a question from somebody in our audience. How many Afghans are being held in prison without trial in Afghanistan?
More than 1,550 is what the U.S. military is saying. So probably around 1,600. We don't know the exact number. About 42 of those are not Afghan. And one thing that we learned during this trip, which was very disturbing, and we hadn't known about this before, was that the non-Afghans are actually in a worse position because about more than a dozen of them, we're not sure exactly how many, have been cleared for release by one of these detainee review boards, which is the hearings we were talking about. The board of 3 officers has said this person should be released or transferred out of this prison, and yet they're still stuck there. And they haven't been told why, and we couldn't get an answer why either. So that's the situation of non-Afghans. But to answer your question directly, there's more than 1,500, probably around 1,600 Afghans being detained at Bagram without trial.
There's another question here on what Bagram actually looks like. Can you explain what the day-to-day operation there looks like?
Well, we actually didn't get to see all that much of Bagram. We were kept under a rather tight leash by the military authorities there, and we came onto the base and were immediately and very directly escorted by a number of good-sized military personnel to precisely the locations that they were willing to have us go to and to know others. And those locations were only the area at which these detainee review board proceedings were being conducted. So we did not see the detention facilities themselves. We did not see any other aspects of the base, which is a huge sprawling facility. Bagram was built on the remains of the main former Soviet base in Afghanistan. It has a jet airfield. It really is a huge facility, but we were only able to see that portion of it in which the detainee review boards were being conducted.
We should also mention that we did see one Afghan trial being conducted at the Bagram Air Base, and the U.S. military is starting to kind of sponsor or mentor or work in conjunction with the Afghan government to start having Afghan trials on the air base. The one that we saw was even worse than the U.S. hearings that we saw in terms of due process. It was, it's a separate set of issues in a sense because it's held by the Afghan government, but this is kind of where the system is, what the system is moving towards is the Afghan government holding these trials. And again, in this case, you had a defense lawyer representing the detainee, but the defense lawyer didn't say very much. Again, there was no evidence presented. There was no witnesses brought into court. There was no examination or cross-examination of witnesses since they weren't there. And there appeared to be also reliance on secret evidence provided by the Afghan security, although it wasn't clear to us because it wasn't discussed in open session.
And the accused was found guilty and sentenced to 5 years in prison, and the whole proceeding lasted about, 15 minutes?
Yeah, the judges, there were 3 judges that got up, they walked out of the room to make their decision, they came back 5 minutes later, and that was after the 15-minute trial. And this is what the U.S. was actually showcasing to us as a great improvement in the Afghan justice system. So that's one reason we're concerned. I mean, we knew that the Afghan justice system had a lot of problems, and Human Rights First and Gabor, you've looked at some of these issues in the past, but we had a hope that perhaps with the help of the U.S. military, which has been there now for 10 years, that the system would have somewhat improved, or that at least these trials that they're sponsoring on the U.S. military base would be in better shape than they seem to be in at this point. I mean, in all fairness, they've only started kind of cooperating with the Afghan government and creating this sort of new justice center where they're having these trials, and so it's still a work in progress, but we're hoping that that's going to improve.
And it's a really important issue because the grand plan for the U.S. is to transition detention authority from U.S. authorities to Afghan hands.